Still can't keep a job, huh? Dad's voice cut through the laughter like a blade. Everyone around the grill laughed, everyone except me. The sun was low, throwing gold over the backyard, over the folding chairs filled with people who'd known me since I was little. My father, Thomas Evans, stood by the grill in his spotless apron spatula in hand, playing host and hero. I sat on the edge of the picnic table, hands locked around a sweating glass of lemonade, pretending the smoke from the charcoal made my eyes sting. Mr. Harrison, Dad's boss, leaned against the deck railing, smiling politely, the kind of smile that said he'd seen this show before. Claire's always had a hard time keeping one thing steady, Dad continued, flipping a burger with too much force. 3 jobs in 2 years, right, sweetheart? Guess she gets that restless streak from her mother. Lillian, my mother, winced as the guests chuckled. She passed me a fresh glass of water, her hand trembling just slightly. Thomas, she said softly. But he didn't hear or pretended not to. Every family has a stage. Ours just happened to have a grilled cheap wine and an audience that loved a good laugh. He went on louder this time, as if volume made the story funnier. Remember when she said she was going to innovate? Some big ideas about consulting startups. I told her, honey, there's no shame in working a steady job like your old man. Turns out she didn't listen. More laughter. Someone slapped his back. Someone else whispered, poor girl. I smiled tightly, the muscles in my cheeks aching. If humiliation had a flavor, it would taste like grilled meat and cheap beer. Mr. Harrison chuckled politely, setting his drink down. You know, Thomas, some people just take longer to find their place. That's all. His voice was calm, but his eyes lingered on me a second too long, sharp, calculating, curious. Oh, she's had plenty of chances, Dad said, taking a sip of his drink. You know what she told me last week? She's been working with some new company, Nova. Something says she's in acquisitions now. He laughed again. Acquisitions? That's what she calls it. For the first time all evening, Harrison straightened his brow, furrowing. Nova Capital. The sound of the name froze the table. My father looked surprised. Yeah, I think that's it. Why? You've heard of them. Harrison's expression shifted into something unreadable. Heard of them, Thomas. Our board just approved an acquisition offer from Nova Capital. The laughter died instantly. Harrison set down his glass. In fact, the buyer's name was Claire Evans. You wouldn't happen to... My father's hand shook. The stem of his wineglass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the patio stones. He stared at me, face pale, mouth opening, but no sound coming out. What I met his eyes, steady, calm. I told you, Dad. I was just changing jobs. For a long, brutal moment, no one moved. The clinking of wind chimes filled the silence. Lillian blinked rapidly, glancing between us as if trying to translate a language she didn't understand. Mr. Harrison broke the tension with a soft laugh, not mocking but impressed. Well, I'll be damned, he said quietly. Looks like the student bought the classroom. I didn't smile. My father looked at me as if he didn't recognize who I was. Maybe for the first time in my life he didn't. Dinner continued after that, awkward and disjointed. Conversations stumbled. People avoided eye contact. Even the air seemed heavier. My father hardly spoke, his proud posture slumped. When the plates were cleared, Lillian reached over and rested her hand on mine. I always knew you'd find your way, she whispered. I stared down at the tablecloth, tracing the pattern with my fingertip. Not sure if I found it, I said softly. Maybe I just built it out of anger. Across the yard, Mr. Harrison was lighting a cigar, the orange glow flaring against the twilight. He caught my gaze and smiled faintly. Anger builds empires, Ms. Evans, he said. Voice low, meant only for me. If you learn when to stop. I nodded, but something inside me already knew I wasn't ready to stop. The night air cooled as the guests trickled away. Dad stayed behind, collecting empty bottles in silence. I stood a few feet away, watching him. His hands moved slowly, almost mechanically. He didn't look at me when he spoke. You embarrassed me tonight. His voice was flat without the fire it usually carried. You could have told me. You wouldn't have listened, I said. He turned then eyes glassy hurt and disbelief battling in them. You bought the company I work for, Claire. What kind of daughter does that? The kind you taught to win, I said. For a moment he looked ready to answer, then he just sighed and walked inside, shoulders bent. I stood there a while longer listening to the faint hum of the crickets and the echo of old laughter that no longer sounded funny. Lillian appeared in the doorway. Claire, she called softly. Let it go tonight. Please. But I couldn't. Because deep down, beneath the thrill of victory, there was something hollow, something that whispered that this wasn't triumph. It was a loss. That night, lying awake in my childhood room, I could still see Dad's face, stunned, small, broken. I'd wanted him to see me as more than a disappointment. Instead, I'd made him feel what I'd felt for years, powerless. And the strangest part was, it didn't make me feel better. It made me feel exactly like him. That night my father's laughter stopped, but so did my peace, because the moment you win through vengeance, you've already lost something bigger. The house was silent, the grill cold. The empire I'd built out of anger had begun, but I hadn't realized yet that every empire built on revenge eventually burns its own architect. 4 years before that barbecue humiliation, I was the daughter everyone pitied. The one between jobs. The one my father said would never make it on her own. Back then, I still believed family meant protection. I didn't know it could also mean the first cut that makes you bleed. The day I quit Goldworth Financial, the Texas heat was unforgiving. I remember standing outside the building, the glass walls reflecting a sky too blue for what I was feeling. I had just walked out after 3 years holding a box of my things, family photos, a mug that said future CFO, and a letter of resignation that felt more like a confession. I'd exposed my department head for hiding fraudulent investments targeting elderly clients. When HR told me to quietly resign for everyone's benefit, I walked out with my dignity but without a paycheck. That night my father called. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't even sound surprised. So you quit again? Or did they finally fire you this time? I didn't get fired, I said quietly. I couldn't work for people who lie. He laughed low and cruel. You and your moral compass. Integrity doesn't pay the bills, Claire. You should have kept your mouth shut. I kept my soul intact, Dad. Yeah, well, you can't pay rent with your soul. He hung up before I could answer. The line went dead, leaving a ringing emptiness that was louder than any of his insults. I pressed my hands to my temples, feeling the sheer crushing weight of his judgment. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a fundamental rejection of who I was. That was the first time I realized my father didn't see me as a daughter anymore. I was just a disappointment that carried his last name. When the savings ran out, I packed what was left of my life into 3 boxes and moved back to my parents' house. It wasn't home anymore. It was a museum of everything my father believed in, awards, framed photos of him, shaking hands with executives and plaques that read, Thomas Evans, Regional Director. Every piece of wood and brass whispered the same thing: he won. You lost. Dinner was a performance. My mother Lillian tried to keep peace with small talk about the neighbors. My younger brother Ben stared at his plate, pretending not to exist. But my father filled every silence with judgment. When I was your age, I'd already been promoted twice, he said, carving his steak. When I was your age, I said softly, women weren't allowed to speak in your meetings. The knife in his hand froze midair. Watch your tone, he said. I'm just stating facts, Dad. He slammed his knife down, the sound sharp enough to make Lillian flinch. In this house, facts are what I say they are. No one spoke after that. The only sound was the slow ticking of the grandfather clock, a cruel reminder of time passing wasted. Ben found me later on the porch staring into the dark yard. You should just ignore him, he whispered. He's old school. I smiled faintly. Old school doesn't have to mean cruel. He's scared, Ben said. You remind him of what he could have been if he'd taken risks. Then he shouldn't punish me for taking them. Inside through the window, I could see my father sitting in his recliner, watching the evening news about the latest stock market surge. His expression was the same one he wore at church, Solemn, self-righteous, untouchable. A week later, during another family dinner, it happened again. My father lifted his glass of wine. "You know, Claire, maybe if you hadn't quit, I could actually brag about you for once." I looked up from my plate calm. "Maybe I don't want to be bragged about. Maybe I just want to be respected." He chuckled. "Respect is earned, not demanded." I met his eyes. "Then maybe you should try earning mine." The room froze. Lillian's hand trembled as she reached for her glass. Ben looked between us, pleading silently for peace. But my father wasn't built for peace, he was built for dominance. "In this family," he said, voice low and cold, "I decide what respect means. Then maybe I don't belong in this family anymore." The glass in his hand shattered against the table. Red wine bled into the white tablecloth like a wound spreading across clean skin. "Get out," he whispered. Lillian gasped, "Thomas." But I was already standing. "You don't have to ask twice." That night I packed my bags in silence. Lillian appeared in the doorway, her robe wrapped tight around her eyes, red. "Where will you go?" "Anywhere I can breathe," I said. She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "He's not a bad man, Claire. He's just scared of being forgotten." I looked at her, the woman who'd spent her life standing in his shadow. Then he shouldn't have tried to erase me. She wanted to hug me, but she didn't. Years of fear had trained her body to stop short of rebellion. I zipped my bag, walked past her, and opened the front door. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows on the driveway. My old car sat there, paint-chipped the engine, coughing like an old smoker. As I started it, I caught one last glimpse of my father through the window. He was still in his chair, still watching the news, still pretending nothing had changed. But everything had. The road stretched before me, dark, empty, endless. I rolled down the window, letting the warm wind hit my face. The farther I drove, the lighter I felt. Dallas faded behind me, and with it the weight of his voice. Halfway down the highway, the dashboard light flickered, and the gas needle hovered near empty. I laughed out loud, half despair, half freedom. I didn't know where I was going, only that it had to be somewhere else. Somewhere he couldn't define me anymore. When I stopped at a gas station outside Austin, I looked at my reflection in the window. My eyes were tired, my clothes wrinkled, but there was something alive behind the exhaustion, something that refused to die. That night, I checked into a cheap motel off the interstate. The sheets smelled of bleach, the air conditioner rattled like a dying fan, and the wallpaper peeled in long curls. But for the first time in months, I slept without hearing his voice in my head. In the morning, I woke to the sound of birds outside the window, and a thought that felt like a heartbeat. Maybe failure isn't the opposite of success. Maybe it's the beginning of it. I didn't know it yet, but Austin would become the place where everything changed, where the humiliation I carried would turn into something sharp and unbreakable. That night, I called Lillian one last time. She answered on the second ring. "I'm safe," I said. "Don't worry." "I'll always worry," she whispered. "But I'm proud of you. Even if your father isn't." I smiled, tears stinging my eyes. "Tell him, he doesn't have to believe in me. I'll believe enough for both of us." When I hung up, the motel room felt less empty. I opened my laptop, searched for jobs, and found nothing that fit. But that didn't matter. I wasn't looking for another job. I was looking for a reason. That night, as the highway lights flickered outside the window, I made myself a quiet promise. One day I'll build something that makes him see me. I didn't know how or when or with what money, but I knew why. And that was enough to start. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark, I'd rather be broke with a purpose than rich under someone else's thumb. The hum of the highway outside was my only witness as I drifted into sleep, unaware that the next morning, a chance encounter in a small Austin cafe would plant the seed that changed everything. I didn't have a plan or money or anyone who believed in me. All I had was silence and a stubborn refusal to disappear. After leaving my father's house, I drove into Austin with what was left of my savings and a car that coughed every 2 miles. The city skyline glowed ahead, like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. I rented a tiny apartment above a laundromat, A single room that smelled faintly of detergent and loneliness. The floorboards creaked with every step. The walls were thin enough to hear strangers' arguments through, and yet it was the first space that was truly mine. For weeks I searched for work. My resume polished, filled with corporate experience, meant nothing once employers saw a former whistleblower whispered through reference checks. No one wanted the woman who made noise. Eventually, I found a job at a small coffee shop near downtown. It was nothing glamorous, $6 an hour plus tips, but it paid for groceries and the illusion of normalcy. Every morning I put on my plain apron, tied my hair into a bun, and reminded myself that this wasn't a failure. It was a pause. One morning in late August, the Texas sun was already beating down by 9 a.m. The cafe was crowded, filled with suits tapping on laptops, conversations about stock prices and weekend lake trips. I balanced a tray of cappuccinos when my elbow caught the edge of a table. Coffee spilled across an open laptop. My heart dropped. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I stammered, grabbing napkins expecting shouting or a furious glare. Instead, the woman sitting there chuckled softly. She was in her 60s, with silver hair cut sharp at the jawline, wearing a navy suit that radiated quiet authority. "Don't worry," she said, closing the laptop gently. "This thing survived worse. 3 CEOs and 2 recessions." Something about the way she said it made me look up. "3 CEOs, I asked." She smiled. "Margaret Moore. Retired now, but old habits die hard." She extended her hand, firm but warm. "And you are Claire Evans," I said, cheeks still flushed. "Part-time barista. Full-time disappointment." Her eyebrows lifted. "That's quite a title." "Who decided that I hesitated?" "My father. And maybe the world." "Well," she said, leaning back, "neither seem very qualified to judge." I didn't know why, but I sat down for a moment, tray forgotten. Maybe it was her calmness or the way she looked at me like she'd seen hundreds of people fall apart and rebuild again. She asked what I used to do, and I told her finance, corporate investments, then the whistleblowing that ended it all. When I finished expecting pity, she simply nodded. "Let me guess," she said. "You told the truth, and they told you to be quiet." I blinked. "Pretty much." "Good," she said. "That means you still have your soul. Most people trade theirs for stock options before they hit 30. Her bluntness made me laugh for the first time in weeks. She stirred her coffee, watching the swirl. "What do you want now, Claire?" I hesitated. "I don't know. I want to help small businesses, the kind that get crushed by people like my old company. The ones that play fair and still lose." She smiled knowingly. "So you want to build a company that saves other companies?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, exactly that." She reached for a napkin, pulled a pen from her jacket, and scribbled something down. Then she slid it toward me. On the napkin were 3 words: purpose plus integrity equals power. "Everyone talks about profit," she said. "But power built on profit alone collapses. Power built on purpose lasts. The question is, do you dare to own yours?" Her words landed deep. I swallowed hard. "What if I fail again?" She leaned in. "Failure doesn't kill people. Comfort does." She pulled out a business card and handed it to me. "When you're ready to stop surviving and start building, call me." Then she stood, adjusted her blazer, and walked out into the sunlight, leaving me holding a damp napkin and a spark I hadn't felt in years. That night I couldn't sleep. I laid the business card on my desk and stared at it for hours. Margaret Moore, Moore and Gray Partners, retired. The word retired looked like an invitation, not an ending. I pulled out an old notebook and began to write sketches and circles and wild ideas bleeding across the page. At the top I wrote Nova Capital, rebuilding dignity through finance. For weeks that phrase became my mantra. Every morning before work, I'd research local businesses failing under debt. Every night I'd email strangers offering free financial analysis, hoping anyone would give me a chance. Most never replied. Some politely declined. A few told me I was naive, that one person couldn't fix an unfair system. Still I persisted. Bills piled up. My bank account drained. Some nights I'd eat ramen staring at the flickering light in the hallway, wondering if my father was right. Maybe integrity really didn't pay the bills. But every time that thought came, I pictured his smirk, his wine glass, the laughter that echoed at every family BBQ. That memory burned like fuel. 3 months later, I received a voicemail from Lillian. Her voice was faint-tired. "Claire, your dad doesn't know I'm calling, but I just wanted to hear your voice. Things have been hard here." I called back immediately. She said she'd been ill, that he barely spoke to her anymore. I offered to visit, but she whispered, "No, it'll only start another fight." Later that night, my phone rang again. This time it was him. "Thomas Evans. So," he said, still chasing fantasies, "I heard you're working at a coffee shop now." "Impressive." I clenched my jaw. "I'm building something real, Dad. It just takes time." He scoffed. "You think I didn't build from nothing? I worked my whole life to make sure you'd never have to struggle like this. And now you choose to. I'd rather struggle for something I believe in than succeed at something I don't." There was a pause, a low exhale. Then, "Don't come crying when the world teaches you the same lesson it taught me." He hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked down at my hands, calloused from work, ink-stained from notes, and whispered to myself, maybe it's time the world learned something from me. Days turned into weeks. My routine became a rhythm of exhaustion and obsession. Wake up at dawn, brew coffee, work my shift, return home, research, reach out, repeat. The city outside moved fast, oblivious to my quiet war. Then one rainy evening, as I sat in my apartment surrounded by unpaid bills and rejected emails, my laptop chimed. New message. The subject line read, "Urgent help needed with financial restructuring." I hesitated before opening it. The sender's name was unfamiliar. Barton & Sons Manufacturing, a struggling mid-sized company based right here in Texas. The message was brief. "We've been turned down by every bank. We need someone to help us survive. Are you available for a meeting this Friday?" I stared at the screen, the rain tapping against the window like a heartbeat. My chest tightened. This was it, the first door creaking open after months of knocking. I typed a reply with trembling hands. "Friday works. Let's rebuild something worth believing in." As I hit send, I glanced at the napkin still pinned to the wall. Purpose plus integrity equals power. The coffee shop uniform hung over the chair. Tomorrow, I'd wear a suit again, not to please anyone, but to reclaim who I was meant to be. The world doesn't hand you second chances. You carve them out with your bare hands. And as the storm outside grew louder, I whispered into the dark, "Looks like the seed just found its soil." The email came at 2 a.m, subject line, "Urgent help. Company on the edge." I didn't know it then, but that single message would drag me into the fire that forged who I became. My laptop screen glowed in the dark of my tiny Austin apartment. The message was from a man named Jim Rivera, owner of a small glass manufacturing company in Waco. His words were desperate. "Our factory is weeks from closing. I've heard about what you do. Please, if there's any way to save us, I'll listen." I stared at the email for a long time. The company name Sierra Glassworks meant nothing to me, but the exhaustion and humility in his message did. I replied, "Let's meet tomorrow morning. I'll drive down." By sunrise, I was on the highway, windows down, Texas air whipping through my hair. I didn't have an assistant or even a proper business card. Just me, a half-broken laptop, and the stubborn belief that people like Jim deserved a chance. Sierra Glassworks sat at the edge of an industrial lot. The once blue factory walls faded to dull gray. Workers moved slowly through the yard. Shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. Inside, the air smelled of dust and burnt sand. Machines stood still, silent as tombstones. Jim Rivera met me near the loading dock, his face drawn and tired. "You can't save a dying dream, Miss Evans," he said with a resigned half-smile. "Maybe not," I answered, pulling out my notebook. "But I can help it breathe again." He laughed softly, not out of humor, but disbelief. "You sound like every banker who's ever promised hope and sent another bill instead." "I'm not a banker," said, meeting his eyes. "I'm someone who knows what it feels like to be dismissed." That caught his attention. He led me inside his small office where papers were stacked like fallen dominoes. I asked for his financial statements. His hands trembled as he handed them over. The numbers were a mess. Debt piled on delayed payments, but something stood out. The company's biggest client owed them nearly $200,000 and hadn't paid in months. They weren't bankrupt. They were stuck in limbo. "You don't need miracles," I told him. "You need leverage." Jim sighed. "Banks don't listen to people like us anymore." "They'll listen to me," I said. I wasn't sure if I believed it yet, but sometimes conviction has to come before certainty. For 3 straight weeks, I buried myself in spreadsheets, redrafted contracts, and wrote appeal proposals. I called 3 banks' scheduled meetings, pitched the restructuring plan as if Sierra Glassworks were a rising star instead of a collapsing relic, and each one said no. One bank manager, his voice thick with condescension, said, "Your company doesn't even have a track record, Miss Evans." "Who are you again?" I swallowed the sting. "Track records start somewhere," I said quietly. But when the call ended, I sat in my car in the bank's parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel. The sound of my father's voice echoed in my mind. "You'll never keep a real job, Claire. You don't belong in this world." Tears welled up not because of rejection, but because they were starting to sound just like him. The next day, clouds rolled over Waco, the air thick and humid. Rain began to fall as I stood outside Sierra Glassworks. Jim was in the doorway watching me approach. I held up the soaked folder of reports. "We're not done yet," I said. He stared at me bewildered. "You're either the craziest person I've ever met or the bravest." "Maybe both," I replied. That night I stopped at a diner near the interstate to work. The place was lit by flickering neons smelling of burnt coffee and stale French fries. The low, dull clamor of the late shift filled the booths. My laptop battery was dying, the Wi-Fi slow, and exhaustion clung to my skin. I ordered a coffee and opened the same spreadsheet for the 100th time, trying to see what I'd missed. "You're running a financial model on Excel 2010, a voice said beside me. I turned. A man in his early 30s sat at the next booth, sleeves rolled up, laptop open. His tone wasn't mocking, just amused. "It's what I can afford," I said. "When you're broke, creativity becomes a currency." He smiled. "Fair enough. Mind if I take a look?" I hesitated, but turned the screen toward him. He studied it for a moment, fingers drumming the table. "You're trying to refinance debt through conventional channels. That'll never work. But if you create employee share ownership, you can reduce liability and boost trust simultaneously." I blinked. "Who are you, Leo Tran?" he said, extending his hand. "Used to work on Wall Street. Got tired of watching people lie for a living." I shook his hand. "Claire Evans. Used to get fired for telling the truth." He grinned. "We might make a dangerous pair." For the next few hours, Leo and I rewrote everything not as a bailout, but a partnership. We built a plan where every worker would own a small piece of Sierra Glassworks. It wasn't just about saving a business, it was about giving people something to fight for. When we presented the idea to Jim and his employees, they looked skeptical at first. But as Leo explained how it worked, how profits would circle back into their own hands, a spark returned to their eyes. One man in the back said, "You mean we'd actually own part of this place?" "Yes," I said, "because no one protects what they don't own." Jim's voice trembled. "If we're going down, at least we go down fighting." 2 months later, Sierra Glassworks wasn't thriving, but it was breathing again. They secured a small investment from a local supplier and reopened one of their furnaces. The sound of glass molds clinking filled the air like music. When the first batch came out perfect, Jim hugged me with rough, calloused hands. "You did it," he said. "No," I corrected. "We did it." I drove back to Austin that night, windows open, wind cooling the sweat from my neck. For the first time in years, I felt something pure, not pride, but peace. At a red light, I opened my email out of habit. There it was, potential investment inquiry, Harrison and Cumbie Manufacturing. My stomach tightened. The name tugged at something deep, familiar, and buried. I clicked it open. The logo at the top, blue and gold, was one I'd seen my entire childhood on my father's briefcases. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. Harrison and Cumbu, I whispered. Why does that name sound so familiar? Leo texted me a few minutes later. New client. I typed back, maybe. Or maybe it's something else entirely. Outside my car, the traffic light turned green, reflecting off the windshield in a cold emerald glow. I didn't move. The universe, it seemed, had a strange sense of humor handing me the past, just when I thought I'd escaped it. I closed my laptop, slowly exhaled, and whispered to the empty night, looks like the fire's just getting started. Some ghosts don't haunt houses, they haunt your inbox. When I opened that email, I thought it was just another client. I was wrong. It was the very place my father had worshipped for 30 years. The subject line read, Investment Inquiry, Harrison and Cumby Manufacturing. The message was short, urgent, written in the clipped defensive tone of someone trying to sound in control while everything was falling apart. We are seeking consultation regarding financial restructuring and investor retention. Immediate assistance required. Thomas Evans, Operations Director. My stomach dropped. For a long moment, I just stared at the name at the bottom of the email. Thomas Evans, my father. The man who had once told me, people like you don't build companies. They get hired by people like me. The man who laughed at my unemployment, who measured love in promotions, and who believed stability was the only currency that mattered. And now he was the one asking for help to keep his job. I didn't reply. Not yet. I printed the documents attached to the email, financial statements, debt reports, operational budgets, and spread them across the kitchen table. Numbers never lied. They were cold, factual, merciless. Leo walked in with 2 coffees and froze when he saw the name at the top of the files. Evans. Wait, isn't that? Yes, I said quietly. He hesitated. Your dad? I nodded, my eyes still scanning the reports. He's in trouble. Leo leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Are you going to tell him who you are? Not yet. He frowned. You're sure about this? I'm not doing this for him, I said. I'm doing it for the company. And maybe for myself. The deeper I read, the clearer it became that Harrison & Co. wasn't just struggling, it was bleeding. Cash flow, collapsing investors, leaving key contracts defaulting. There was something off. Too many miscellaneous transfers, too many internal reimbursements approved by one name, Thomas Evans. Leo noticed it too. These transfers don't make sense. Someone's moving money around. He's either hiding something, I murmured, or trying to buy silence. I closed the folder. We're going to Dallas. The next morning we drove 5 hours north. The city skyline came into view like an old photograph, familiar and unwelcome. I hadn't been back in years. The last time I'd left with a suitcase and a promise never to return. Now I was back as someone my father didn't even know existed, a woman he'd taught to stay quiet, returning as the one thing he couldn't ignore. The building looked smaller than I remembered, but the air still smelled the same coffee metal and a hint of pride, too old to breathe. I remembered being 8 years old, spinning in his leather office chair, laughing and hearing him say, "This is where real people work." I whispered to myself, yeah, real people with fake numbers. Leo shot me a quick look, unsure if he should laugh. We walked into the marble lobby. The receptionist smiled professionally. Welcome to Harrison & Co. You must be the consultants from Nova Capital. Yes, I said, extending a hand. Claire Evans and Leo Tran. She led us to the elevator, all polished chrome and quiet tension. As we rode up, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, a composed stranger staring back. I barely recognized her. The doors opened to the executive floor. Mr. Harrison himself greeted us, his handshake firm but his eyes tired. A man used to command, now fighting to maintain dignity. Thank you for coming on short notice, he said. We're in a difficult position. We'll do our best to help, I replied evenly. He motioned us to sit. Our operations director has been overpromising for months. We're losing key investors. Some contracts are questionable, Leo asked casually. Who's managing those? Thomas Evans. Harrison said, his tone heavy. He's loyal, but lately his performance has been inconsistent. The words stung more than I expected. I hid it behind a polite nod. Then we'll start by reviewing his department. Harrison's brows lifted slightly. I like your precision. Most consultants talk. You act. I smiled faintly. Action is the only language I speak. For the next several days, Leo and I combed through every record we could access. We worked long hours in a borrowed conference room with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly like a nervous heartbeat. The deeper we went, the worse it looked. Large sums had been rerouted through a small contractor called Everside Logistics. At first glance, it seemed legitimate, until we found that Everside shared the same post office box as an old associate of my father's, a man named Rick Porter. Leo pushed his chair back. He's funneling money out. Classic shell setup. I stared at the screen. My pulse hammered in my ears. No, I said softly. He's not just stealing. He's protecting something. Leo frowned. Protecting what reputation, I whispered. It's the only thing he's ever worshipped. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the old computer filling the air. I remembered his face at every dinner table, how he spoke about loyalty and success as if they were the same word. I finally spoke. When he humiliated me for quitting my job, I thought he was proud. Turns out he was terrified. Terrified I'd stop needing his approval. Leo leaned forward. You think Harrison knows? I shook my head. Not yet. And I don't plan on telling him until I see how deep this goes. By the fourth day, I knew the company was standing on a cliff. If the investors pulled out, Harrison and Company would collapse within weeks. Every employee, hundreds of families would lose their livelihoods, including my father. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stood by the window of the 15th floor looking down at the glowing city below. The office next door still had its lights on. Through the frosted glass, I could see the shadow of a man hunched over his desk, my father. He was still there working late, probably drafting another desperate report to the board. I remembered being a child waiting for him to come home, dinner cold on the table. He always said, "One day you'll understand responsibility." Now I whispered back to that memory. Let's see how responsible you really are. Leo walked up behind me. You're not just saving this company, are you? I didn't look away from the window. No, I said quietly. I'm saving my name. We stood there in silence for a long moment. Below us, the city lights flickered like tiny embers, each one a reminder that every flame starts with friction. When we finally turned to leave, I glanced one last time at the office across the hall. His shadow hadn't moved. The man who once taught me power through fear was about to learn the truth that silence and obedience weren't strength. That the daughter he dismissed as unemployed was now the woman holding the fate of his company in her hands. And this time, I wouldn't look away. The past wasn't done with me, and I wasn't done with it. The first time I saw my father again, he didn't recognize me. It was a Monday morning, gray skies over Dallas, the kind that made the glass towers look like tombstones. I walked into Harrison and Company's boardroom, wearing a charcoal suit and quiet confidence. My badge read, Claire Evans, Nova Capital Advisors. His eyes passed over me as if I were just another consultant in the long parade of people trying to fix what he had broken. Morning, everyone, Thomas said briskly, his tone clipped, rehearsed. Let's keep this short. We have real work to do. I almost laughed. Real work. That phrase again. The same words he used when he told me I didn't belong in his world. Mr. Harrison motioned for me to sit. Claire, please walk us through your initial findings. My heart thudded once, then steadied. I stood and projected the financial report on the screen. Numbers filled the wall like cold light. Your operational losses aren't random, I said evenly. They're systematic. Someone has been authorizing redundant contracts and rerouting funds through shell vendors. Thomas frowned. That's impossible. I've reviewed every document myself. I looked at him directly this time. I'm sure you have. The air thinned. Mr. Harrison shifted in his chair, sensing the tension but not its source. Let's keep emotions out of this, Claire continued. I clicked to the next slide. These payments over $2 million went through Everside Logistics. The address doesn't exist. The owner of the record, a man named Carl Denton. I paused, letting the silence grow heavy. He's listed as a close associate of your operations director. Thomas's jaw tightened. Are you implying I had anything to do with that? I'm implying, I said softly, that whoever did this left a trail, and I intend to follow it. A murmur rippled through the room. The other executives exchanged uneasy looks. Mr. Harrison's voice came out low. Thomas, is this true? He slammed his pen on the table. Of course not. This is absurd. She's twisting numbers to make herself look clever. For a moment, I wanted to tell him everything who I was, what this really was about. But I held the words back. Revenge isn't loud. It's precise. When the meeting adjourned, Mr. Harrison asked to see me privately. The boardroom emptied, leaving just the echo of expensive shoes and my father's anger lingering in the air. Claire Harrison said, closing the door, You've got talent. But Thomas has been with me for 30 years. Be careful how you present these findings. Loyalty matters here. Loyalty, I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. Yes, it does. He gave a small nod and left. Minutes later, I found my father pacing near the elevators. He turned as I approached. Who the hell do you think you are? Someone doing her job, I said. You embarrassed me in front of the entire board. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from rage. Do you have any idea what that means in this company? I smiled faintly. Maybe it means accountability. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. You don't know this business. You're just another outsider trying to prove a point. You think numbers tell the truth? Numbers are tools. They say whatever we need them to. That's the problem, I said quietly. You started believing your own lies. For a split second, I saw confusion flicker in his eyes, something almost human. Then he laughed cold and hollow. You're just like your mother. All heart, no strategy. He walked away, leaving me standing in the sterile hallway, fluorescent light buzzing overhead. I wanted to scream to tell him I wasn't his little girl anymore. But the words would have been wasted. He didn't listen to the truth, only to pride. That night, Leo and I sat in a dim hotel room surrounded by files. He's covering something bigger, Leo said, flipping through spreadsheets. These payments go back 5 years. There's another layer, someone above him. I nodded, scanning the documents. Harrison's name never appears directly, but the timing matches his offshore accounts. So they're both in it, maybe. Or maybe one's using the other as a shield. Leo looked at me over the papers. Claire, if this goes public, your father could lose everything. He already did, I said. He just doesn't know it yet. Silence stretched between us. The only sound was the low hum of the city through the hotel window. Are you sure you can keep this wall up? Leo asked, pretending not to know him. I've pretended worse, I whispered. The next morning, I returned to Harrison & Company for another audit session. This time my father was waiting outside the conference room, arms crossed. I know who sent you, he said flatly. Margaret Moore. She's always had it out for me. Maybe she just believes in accountability, I replied. He leaned closer, his tone mocking. You think this is justice? It's politics. When this backfires, you'll go down with the rest of us. I'm not part of us, I said. He blinked, surprised by the finality in my voice. You sound familiar, he muttered almost to himself. What's your full name again? I forced a neutral smile. Claire Evans. He froze. The recognition hit him like a slow-moving wave. His lips parted, but no sound came. Before he could speak, the conference room door opened. Mr. Harrison called us in. The moment broke like glass. Inside, the meeting grew heated. I presented a plan: liquidate non-essential assets, fire corrupt middlemen, and open an independent audit. Mr. Harrison looked impressed. My father looked cornered. I disagree, Thomas snapped. This company doesn't need outsiders meddling in internal affairs. Mr. Harrison's patience wore thin. Outsiders are the only ones I trust right now. Thomas turned red. You're making a mistake. Harrison's tone turned icy. No, Thomas. You did. The room fell silent. My father's eyes found mine again, searching for understanding or perhaps mercy. He found neither. After the meeting, I stood by the window overlooking downtown Dallas. Leo joined me. "He knows," he said quietly. "I know," I answered. "Then why not end it now? Tell them who you are." I watched my father through the glass walls as he gathered his papers, shoulders slumped for the first time in my life. "Because the truth needs witnesses," I said. "And right now they still think he's untouchable." Leo nodded slowly. "You're playing the long game." "I'm playing for justice," I corrected. That night a storm rolled across Texas. Rain hammered against the hotel windows. My phone buzzed a text from an unknown number. "You think you can destroy me, Claire? Remember I taught you everything you know." I stared at the message, the screen's glow reflected in my glass of wine. My heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with certainty. I typed back 2 words, "Then you should have taught me better." I didn't hit send. Not yet. Instead, I saved the message, took a deep breath, and whispered to the dark, "This isn't revenge anymore. It's justice." Outside, lightning split the sky. Somewhere in that storm, I knew the reckoning had already begun. The morning after the board meeting, Dallas felt charged, the air heavy with unsaid threats. My father knew, but he had no proof I was doing anything more than my consulting job. Yet. I met Margaret Moore for breakfast in a quiet, high-end hotel cafe. She wore the same quiet confidence I remembered from the laundromat coffee shop, but today she was the architect, not the muse. "Thomas called me yesterday," she stated, stirring her herbal tea. "He called me a meddling old woman who was trying to destroy his life's work." I smiled faintly, sipping my coffee. "Did you agree?" I told him he was right about one thing: I am meddling. But I'm not destroying his life's work. I'm saving the company he tried to destroy with his pride. She pushed a thick manila envelope across the table. "This is for you. It's the initial funding needed for the full restructuring of Harrison and Company and the acquisition of their outstanding debt." My heart was hammered. "Margaret, this is massive. I don't understand why you're doing this. You retired. I'm retired from the game, Claire, not from justice." She leaned in, her silver hair gleaming. "I knew Thomas Evans 30 years ago. He was a loyal bulldog for Harrison, but he covered up a major environmental safety violation back in '95, the one that nearly bankrupted Moore and Gray, my old firm. I couldn't prove it then, but I will never forget." She looked directly into my eyes. "You have the integrity I lost sight of. I'm giving you the capital, the legal connections, and the leverage to finish what Thomas started. You're not just saving a company, you're cleaning up a mess that goes back decades. Think of this as my final glorious investment." "And what do you want in return?" I asked, gripping the envelope. One thing she said, her voice dropping. "I want Harrison and Company to survive, and I want the new entity to reflect the values of purpose you drew on that napkin. I want the world to know integrity won." I nodded slowly, thinking of the simple phrase, "purpose plus integrity equals power." "Done," I said. "And Margaret, I need a new name for the parent company. Something that reflects a complete transformation, not just a capital injection." She smiled. "When a company expands beyond simple investment, it becomes a holding structure. It holds all the pieces together. Nova Capital was the seed, Claire. Now it needs to be the root. Nova Holdings." I whispered the name from the future, fitting perfectly into the puzzle of the past. "The holding company that owns the future." "Exactly," Margaret confirmed. "Now you have the power to move. Go buy your father's world." Later that day, back in my hotel room, I called Leo. "It's time to move. We're not consultants anymore, Leo. We're an acquisition firm. We're now Nova Holdings." Leo whistled. "Holdings? That's aggressive. What's the play? Mr. Harrison wants me to perform an independent audit. We're going to give him a deep dive that exposes Thomas Evans, but also reveals how fragile H&C is. We show them that the only viable option is a complete buyout and restructure." As we strategized, my phone buzzed again. It was the text from the night before, the one I hadn't sent. "You think you can destroy me, Claire? Remember I taught you everything you know. I finally hit send on my drafted reply. Then you should have taught me better. Seconds later, Ben, my younger brother, called. His voice was laced with worry. Claire, I heard Dad yelling on the phone this morning. He found out who you are. He's talking about lawsuits about ruining you. He can't ruin me, Ben, I said, my voice steady. He already did that years ago. This is just a rebuild. But Mom Lillian, she's terrified, Ben pleaded. He's taking it out on her. He said if you don't stop, he'll make sure she loses everything too. The words were a physical punch. My chest tightened, the cold control wavering. He was still weaponizing the people I cared about. I won't let that happen, I said, the promise, quiet and absolute. Tell Lillian I love her. And tell Dad, the only thing he's losing is his delusion. I hung up, walking over to the window. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and the hard light of morning. I looked down at the paper pinned above my desk, the words Margaret had given me, purpose plus integrity equals power. I hadn't started this to hurt Lillian or Ben, or even the hundreds of workers at H&C. I started it for justice and self-respect. Now protecting my family meant going through him, not around him. I picked up the phone again, the weight of the moment heavy in my hand. I dialed Mr. Harrison's office, feeling the last vestiges of the daughter Thomas Evans raised burn away. Mr. Harrison, I said, my voice crisp, professional, and entirely new. I have some comprehensive findings for you. I suggest we meet immediately to discuss the terms of an acquisition, not a consultation. The game had officially changed. The fire was no longer forging. It was consuming. You think revenge makes you strong, he said, but look at you now, alone, even when you've won. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the hospital corridor. Machines beeped steadily in the dim light, each sound marking another second of guilt I couldn't undo. My mother lay small and fragile beneath white sheets, her chest rising with shallow effort. Lillian Evans, the one who'd always tried to keep peace between two storms, now lay silent between us. I sat beside her bed, holding her hand. The veins were thin, her skin almost translucent. Mom, I whispered, can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered. Claire, she breathed, barely audible. Promise me. Stop fighting. Tears burned behind my eyes. I promise. In the corner of the room, my father stood motionless, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched. He hadn't spoken since I arrived. The sound of the heart monitor filled the silence between us, rhythmic, accusing. Lillian's eyes flickered open again, faint but clear. You too? She whispered. You're more alike than you know. Then her gaze drifted back toward the ceiling, her breathing settling into the slow rhythm of sleep. Thomas exhaled sharply, the sound half sigh, half anger. He stepped closer, voice low but cutting. You wanted to destroy me. Congratulations, you did. I turned, meeting his stare. No, I said evenly. I wanted you to see me. He gave a dry, bitter laugh. See you, Claire. You bought the company I built my life around. You humiliated me in front of everyone I've ever worked with. You think that's how people earn respect? I didn't want their respect, I said quietly. I just wanted to stop being the punchline at your barbecues. He shook his head, his expression turning hard. You think they respect you now? They fear you. That's not the same thing. I felt the sting of truth in his words. But I wouldn't let him see it. Then maybe fear is all you ever taught me. His face went pale, his eyes narrowing. You always twist everything, don't you? Everything becomes someone else's fault. Because for you, I shot back, it always has to be about fault. Not feelings. Not love. Just winning. The monitor beeped faster for a moment, as if the machines themselves could feel the tension thickening in the air. He took a step closer. You've become exactly what you accused me of being. Cold. Ruthless. Obsessed with control. My throat tightened. Maybe that's the only language you ever understood. For a second, something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, regret, fear. But it vanished as quickly as it came. Some arguments, I said softly, aren't about truth. They're about pain waiting too long to be heard. His hand twitched at his side like he wanted to hit something, Instead, he reached for the cup on the tray beside him, gripped it too tightly, and hurled it to the floor. The crash echoed through the room, shards scattering like punctuation marks in a sentence we'd been speaking for years. "You were supposed to be better than me," he shouted, voice cracking. I stared at him, chest heavy, pulse pounding in my ears. "Maybe I still can be," I whispered. I turned toward the door, ignoring the sting of his words, ignoring the tears threatening to break through. My heels clicked on the linoleum floor as I walked out, leaving him standing by the bed, the man who taught me everything about power and nothing about peace. The hallway outside was blindingly white, humming with the quiet chaos of late-night medicine nurses, whispering machines, beeping footsteps, soft but constant. I stopped at the end of the corridor, pressed my back against the cool wall, and let myself breathe for the first time in what felt like years. Through the glass pane of another room, I saw a young boy clutching his mother's hand. She was pale, tired, her hair wrapped in a scarf. The boy's face was wet with tears as he whispered something against her palm. The sight hit me like a wave. That's what I used to be before power taught me to speak with silence. I realized then how far I'd drifted from the person I was trying to protect. I hadn't saved my mother. I hadn't saved my father. I'd only rebuilt their war in a different uniform. I turned away from the window, pulled my phone from my pocket, and scrolled to Leo's name. My hand trembled before I pressed call. He answered on the second ring, "Claire." I swallowed hard. My voice came out rough. "It's time we fix this," I said. "Fix what? The company, the mess I created, the people I hurt." There was a pause on the other end. "Claire, are you sure?" I looked back through the glass at the boy and his mother. "I'm sure. It has to start from the inside." Leo's voice softened. "Then I'm with you." For the first time in months, I felt the faintest trace of relief, not victory, not pride, just something lighter, cleaner. Maybe this was what strength actually felt like. The hardest part wasn't fighting him. It was realizing I might have to forgive him. When I hung up, I lingered in the corridor, watching the night staff move through their quiet rhythm of care, steady, patient, selfless. The kind of strength my father never understood. The kind I'd forgotten existed. The elevator doors opened at the end of the hall. I walked toward them, slowly glancing once more through the glass at my mother's room. Thomas was still standing there, head bowed, hands clasped, a man carved out of guilt and pride. I wanted to hate him. Instead, all I felt was a strange, fragile pity. The elevator chimed. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the ground floor, and watched the doors slide shut. The reflection staring back at me in the mirrored panel wasn't the ruthless executive the world saw. It was a daughter, exhausted, haunted, finally ready to stop fighting ghosts. As the elevator descended, I whispered to the empty space around me, a promise to my mother, to myself. No more battles. The doors opened to the quiet hospital lobby. Outside, the night was calm, the rain had stopped, and for a brief trembling moment, I believed that maybe, just maybe, redemption had already begun. The courtroom smelled like old wood and quiet fear, the kind of fear that hums under the skin, unspoken but electric. Reporters packed the benches, cameras ready. My father sat across from me in a dark suit that once screamed authority, now hanging loose on his shoulders. His expression was a brittle mask of calm, but his hands gave him away. They wouldn't stop shaking. I stood when my lawyer gestured for me to take the stand. My heels echoed across the floor, sharp and deliberate. I could feel his eyes on me. Thomas Evans, the man who taught me that power meant being louder than everyone else in the room. I was no longer afraid of his voice. "State your name for the record," the judge said. "Claire Evans," I replied, steady and clear. "And your position, founder and CEO of Nova Capital Holdings." A low murmur rippled through the audience. My father's jaw tightened. He had spent 30 years working for Harrison & Company, the company that Nova now owned. I didn't look at him. Not yet. The prosecution began its questioning, sharp and rehearsed. They tried to paint me as reckless, ambitious, manipulative, a daughter who had set out to destroy her own father's career. But with every question I answered with calm precision. Dates, documents, numbers, I had them all memorized. I had built this case from the ground up, brick by painful brick. When they asked why I had pursued the merger that exposed his department's corruption, I didn't hesitate. Because integrity matters, I said, even when it costs you family dinners. A few reporters scribbled that down. The air grew heavier. My father's lawyer stood his voice, brittle with false confidence. Miss Evans, would you say your actions were personal? I met his gaze. Everything becomes personal when someone you love uses power to hurt others. My father shifted uncomfortably. He had chosen to side with the same executives who tried to silence me years ago. To him, admitting wrongdoing was worse than losing everything. When the lawyers finally rested their case, the judge called for a recess. I stepped outside into the courtyard, the cold wind cutting across my face. My hands trembled not from fear, but from release. The years of humiliation, the sleepless nights, the endless silence, it had all led here. Behind me a voice broke through the noise. Claire. I turned. He stood there alone, shoulders hunched, eyes bloodshot. The arrogance was gone. What remained was just a man aging cornered and terrified. Why are you doing this? He asked, voice shaking. You're my daughter. I stared at him for a long moment. Because you stopped being my father the day you chose pride over truth. He flinched like I had slapped him. I was trying to protect this family. No, I said softly. You were trying to protect your image. He looked away, jaw tightening again. You think you've won something here? You've ruined me. I took a step closer, my voice barely above a whisper. No, Dad. You ruined yourself the moment you laughed at your own child for standing alone. For a second, I thought he'd apologize. His lips parted, but the words never came. Instead, he turned and walked away back toward his lawyers, the faint echo of his shoes following him like ghosts. The final session began an hour later. The judge entered, her tone crisp and neutral. We have reviewed the evidence and testimonies regarding the fraudulent practices within Harrison & Company and the involvement of Thomas Evans. I could hear my pulse in my ears. She continued, the court finds sufficient proof that Mr. Evans knowingly participated in concealing financial misconduct. Effective immediately, he is removed from his position and subject to further investigation by federal authorities. The room erupted into a deafening roar. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions, and a bank of cameras flashed, bathing the courtroom in chaotic, blinding light. My father slumped back in his chair, pale as paper. Then silence. I stood, not in triumph, but in stillness. The justice I'd sought for years didn't feel like victory, it felt like closure. The judge's gavel struck once sharp as lightning. Outside the courthouse, microphones and cameras swarmed me. Miss Evans, do you have a statement? Someone shouted. I paused, feeling the weight of 100 lenses trained on my face. I didn't come here to win, I said. I came here to stop pretending that silence is the same as peace. The words spread through the crowd like wildfire. A few clapped. Others just stared, maybe realizing the story wasn't about corporate fraud at all. It was about the price of dignity. When I finally escaped the press, Margaret Moore was waiting by the steps, leaning on her cane, eyes gleaming. Well, she said, smiling faintly, you didn't burn the world down. You rebuilt it. I laughed, the sound was shaky, but real. I don't know about rebuilding. Maybe just leveled the playing field. Same thing she said. We walked together toward the car. As we passed the marble columns, I spotted my father standing near the corner alone. He wasn't talking to reporters now. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of his pride had finally collapsed. Our eyes met across the distance. For a fleeting second, I saw something raw in his expression, shame, maybe regret. But I didn't move toward him. Not yet. Some distances couldn't be closed by words. That night I sat in my apartment, the city lights flickering outside my window. My phone buzzed relentlessly, messages from investors, employees, strangers calling me brave. But none of it mattered. I scrolled to one unsent draft that had sat in my inbox for weeks to Dad. The cursor blinked in silence. I began to type. I didn't destroy you. I just stopped letting you destroy me. Then I deleted it. He wasn't ready to read it. Maybe he never would be. I turned off my phone, exhaled deeply, and stared at the skyline. Austin shimmered in the dark, alive and restless, the same way I felt inside. My life wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rebuilding something that could never be taken again: self-respect. The next morning, I walked into Nova's glass lobby. My team was already there, gathered around the conference table. When they saw me, they broke into applause. I smiled, lifting my hand slightly. "Let's get back to work," I said. As I looked at them, these people who had chosen faith over fear, I realized that justice wasn't the end of my story. It was just the turning point. The reckoning was over. Now comes the rebuilding. The removal of Thomas Evans from Harrison & Company wasn't a firing, it was an erasure. The company sent security to walk him out, not because they feared violence, but because they needed the humiliation to be public, a clear message to everyone else. I was in my office at Nova Capital when the news broke. Leo brought me the phone showing the live feed. My father stood on the marble steps of the Dallas headquarters, holding a small box of personal effects the same size as the box I'd held years earlier outside Goldworth Financial. He looked small and defeated, the Texas sun too bright for the moment. "They're treating him like a thief," Leo whispered, his voice laced with pity. I felt nothing. Or maybe I felt too much to feel anything at all. I just watched numbly as the man who had always been the biggest presence in my life was reduced to a footnote on a breaking news report. He taught me that power is everything I said, closing the laptop. Now he knows what it's like to have none. Later that day, I received a call from Lillian. Her voice was thin, reedy, the sound of glass about to break. "Claire, he's home," she said, her breath catching. "He hasn't spoken a word. He just sits in his chair." "I'm sorry, Mom," I said, and I meant it. My fight had never been with her. "I know what he did to you, Claire. I know. But he's still your father. And he's broken." I closed my eyes, picturing the man who had slammed the phone down on me years ago, the man who laughed at my failures. He should have thought of that before he made his choices. "He is a broken man now," Lillian pleaded. "Please just come home. Just for an hour." I hesitated. Going back was dangerous. It meant tearing down the wall I had built, facing the real reason I had done all this, not to win but to be acknowledged. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," I promised. The next day I drove back to the house on the outskirts of Dallas. The journey felt like crossing a border. The neighborhood was the same, perfectly manicured lawns and quiet wealth. The only difference was the single black mark on the perfect facade, my father's ruin. He was in the den, sitting in his favorite recliner. The television was off. The room was heavy with silence. He didn't look up when I entered. "Thomas," I said, using his first name, the name I used in the boardroom. He finally raised his head. His eyes were dull, unfocused. "Did you come here to gloat?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. "I came here because Mom asked me to. She's a fool for asking," he muttered, looking away. "And you're a fool for coming." I stood my ground. "I came here to tell you I didn't set out to destroy you, Dad. I set out to fix what you broke." He laughed, a choking, terrible sound. "The money. The company, I can rebuild that." "No," I said firmly. The belief that integrity matters more than a title." He turned to me, then anger flickering back in his eyes. "You think you're better than me? You used a hostile takeover to get revenge on your own family. What does that make you, Claire?" I met his gaze, unflinching. "It makes me someone who learned to fight back. You were right about one thing, Dad. I am a natural at acquisitions. I acquired justice." For a moment he looked ready to lash out, to scream, to shatter something. But the rage drained out of him, leaving only exhaustion. He closed his eyes. "You'll regret this," he whispered. "You think you've won, but family ties don't wash clean with power." He walked past me, shoulders rigid, the faint smell of aftershave and desperation lingering in his wake. I didn't turn to watch him go. I couldn't. I stayed until Lillian came in, her face etched with sorrow. "It's enough, Claire," she said, wrapping her arms around me. "You proved your point. Now let's just try to be a family again." I clung to her, the brittle confidence I had worn for years finally cracking. I don't know how, Mom. I really don't. You start by forgiving yourself, she whispered. He'll take longer. But you don't have to wait for him. I left the house feeling heavier than when I arrived, but also strangely whole. The revenge was complete. The emptiness was still there. Power didn't fill the void. It just made the emptiness louder. As I drove away, I saw Thomas standing on the porch watching me go. Not with anger, but with a vacant stillness. He was gone, the father I knew. That night, I sat down with Leo. We were preparing for Nova's biggest acquisition, yet a clean energy startup with immense potential. The work was demanding, but for the first time it felt untainted. What now, Claire? Leo asked, stacking the files. You got the closure you needed. I looked at the city lights of Austin, brighter now than Dallas had ever been. Now we build something that can't be bought or broken, I said. Something real. I picked up the file for the new foundation. I was quietly setting up an organization to provide financial mentorship and seed money for women dismissed from their jobs for reporting misconduct. I named it the Lillian Foundation. I knew then that the true victory wasn't my father's fall. It was my mother's silent strength finally given a voice. The reckoning was over. The work had just begun. The office was quiet, but the work was deafening. With Thomas Evans gone, the rot he'd created was exposed, forcing us to move quickly. Leo and I, now the faces of Nova Holdings at Harrison & Company, spent the next 2 weeks tearing down the old structure and building the new one. We liquidated Thomas's fraudulent shell companies, stabilized cash flow, and most importantly implemented the employee share ownership model we'd first tested at Sierra Glassworks. The employees, hundreds of them, went from being fearful cogs in a machine to invested owners. The change in atmosphere was palpable. The fear in their eyes was replaced by fire. Mr. Harrison watched the process with a mixture of relief and melancholy. He called me into his vast corner office one afternoon. Claire, he said, gesturing to the Dallas skyline I'm putting in my notice. The company is stable now, in better hands than mine ever were. I'm done. You're leaving? I asked, surprised. You were the reason Thomas's pride didn't destroy this place sooner. He smiled faintly. Maybe I was just too loyal for too long. I saw the rot starting with Thomas years ago, but chose silence over confrontation. You taught me the difference between loyalty and accountability. Young lady, I'm going to spend time with my grandkids. He stood and extended his hand. You have earned this, and I'll see you at the BBQ next year as a guest, not a superior. I shook his hand, watching him walk away finally at peace. He was the last ghost of the old order. That evening I drove to my childhood home. I hadn't seen Lillian or Ben since the court decision. The lights were on, but the house felt empty, lacking the suffocating hum of Thomas's presence. Lillian opened the door. Her face pale, but her eyes were clear for the first time in years. They weren't lowered. They met mine. Claire, she whispered, pulling me into a tight hug. It wasn't a fearful embrace. It was the hug of a mother who had finally stopped holding her breath. We sat in the living room, the grandfather clock ticking slowly, a sound that used to represent wasted time, now just a simple passing of hours. I'm so sorry, Lillian said, tears welling up. About Thomas, about everything. You have nothing to apologize for, Mom, I said, using the familiar term gently. He chose his path. He lost everything, Claire, she said, her voice shaking slightly. The house, the accounts, everything tied to Harrison & Co. He won't even look at me. And you, I asked. Are you okay? Lillian took a deep, steadying breath. I'm terrified of the unknown, but I'm not terrified of him anymore. You gave me that, Claire. You showed me that silence wasn't safe. Just then Ben walked in from the kitchen holding 3 glasses of iced tea. He was quiet, but his smile was genuine. Hey, CEO, he said, sitting down next to Lillian. The news said Thomas has been charged with fraud. Is it bad? It's serious, Ben, I admitted. But the biggest part of the case, the corporate chaos, is over. Nova Holdings is cleaning it up. Ben nodded, then leaned forward. The last time I saw him, he said you were trying to destroy the family. Are you going to testify against him? I looked from Ben's worried face to Lillian's steady one. I testified about the facts, Ben. The decision to destroy the family was his when he put his pride above everyone else. I'm not seeking punishment. I'm seeking closure. Lillian reached out and squeezed my hand. We're proud of you, Claire, for what you built. Not just the company, but yourself. For the first time since that terrible BBQ, I felt my self-respect return not as a weapon but as a warmth. I wasn't fighting the world. I was simply existing in it on my own terms. As I drove back to Austin that night, I called Leo. Barton & Sons, Sierra Glassworks, and now Harrison & Company. We've done the impossible, Leo. We didn't just save companies. We proved that purpose plus integrity equals power isn't just a slogan. Leo chuckled. So the foundation is set, CEO. What's the next move? We stabilize H&C completely, I said, watching the city lights blur into streaks of color. We ensure that every employee feels the impact of ownership. And then we plan for the future. The real future. I had left my past behind. Thomas was gone. Mr. Harrison was retired and my family was healing. All that remained was the final chapter, making the success permanent. It began with humiliation around a grill. It ends with peace around a table. A year had passed since the hearing, since the endless headlines, the noise and the storm that nearly devoured everything I loved. The house was warm that evening, the long oak table glowing under soft amber light. Outside, dusk spread across the garden where laughter once came at my expense. This time the laughter was gentle, honest. Didn't think I'd be attending another Evans family dinner, Mr. Harrison said, stepping through the doorway with the careful ease of a man who had finally laid his burdens down. His silver hair caught the light as he smiled. Neither did I said, shaking his hand. I thought you'd sworn off anything involving barbecues and drama. He chuckled. I've retired, not vanished. Besides, I had to see this myself, a family dinner that doesn't end in scandal. I smiled, but my heart was beating faster than I'd expected. There was another guest yet to come. Thomas arrived a few minutes later. He'd lost weight, his steps slower, his suit less sharp. But his eyes, once full of pride and defiance, now carried something quieter, something closer to humility. He hesitated in the doorway, unsure if he was welcome. Lillian was already seated at the table, a light shawl draped over her shoulders. Lillian's smile reached him first. Thomas, she said softly, come in. We saved you a seat. He nodded, his voice low. Thank you, Lillian. When he looked at me, I saw every year of distance between us in a single flicker of his eyes. I gestured toward the empty chair across from mine. You might as well sit before Lillian changes her mind. That earned a few polite laughs from the guests. It was awkward, yes, but it was also real. And after everything we'd been through, that was enough. Dinner began with quiet conversation, the clinking of forks against plates, the low hum of the piano playlist I'd chosen for background. I didn't eat much. My stomach was a knot of anticipation. Halfway through the meal, Thomas cleared his throat. Everyone went still. I was wrong, Claire, he said, voice unsteady but clear. About everything the company you're worth, even what success means. The words landed heavy in the room, softer than I expected, but powerful all the same. I met his gaze. And I was wrong, too. I turned pain into vengeance, and I told myself it was justice. It wasn't. He nodded slowly. You got your strength from me, he said, but your heart, you got that from her. He looked toward Lillian. She reached across the table, her frail fingers touching both our hands. You both finally sound human. The tension dissolved like sugar in warm tea. Outside wind rustled the curtains, and the scent of roses drifted through the open window. For the first time in years, the silence between us wasn't sharp. It was soft, like an exhale that had taken a lifetime to release. After dessert, I stood up, my palms slightly trembling. There's something I'd like to share before everyone leaves. The chatter died down. I took a breath. The Lillian Foundation, I began, isn't just a charity. It's a promise. It will fund women who've lost jobs or direction, women like me who just needed one chance to start again. Lillian's eyes filled with tears. Claire, I smiled at her. You taught me to believe that people can rebuild. That failure isn't the end. Applause filled the room, gentle but sincere. Harrison rose from his chair and clapped last, his expression proud. Now that's legacy, Ms. Evans. I shook my head. It's not a legacy, I said. It's closure. Thomas's voice broke the quiet that followed. Your mother always said you'd turn your pain into something good. I didn't believe her. But she was right. Lillian gave him a look, half amusement, half disbelief. Mark the date, she said. Thomas Evans admits he was wrong twice in one night. Laughter rippled around the table, soft and genuine. I felt my chest loosen the air, easier to breathe. For the first time, it wasn't about power or proving anyone wrong. It was about being whole. Later, as the guests began to leave, Harrison lingered by the doorway. You know, he said when I retired, I worried the next generation would forget what mattered. Tonight, I think we'll be just fine. I smiled. You taught me enough to make sure of it. He tipped his hat, his voice warm. Good night, Claire. Take care of them and yourself. When he was gone, only the three of us remained. The candles burned low, their light flickering across faces that had been strangers once bound now by something quieter than forgiveness, understanding. Thomas looked at me across the table. You think we can start over? I nodded. We already have. Lillian reached for my hand, squeezing gently. You did good, sweetheart. We sat like that for a long while. No raised voices, no unspoken blame. Just the sound of the clock ticking softly in the background. I stood eventually, walked to the window and looked out at the dark garden. A year ago, this same space had been filled with laughter that cut like knives. Now it was filled with the hum of crickets and the distant warmth of life moving forward. My reflection in the glass no longer looked like the woman who built an empire from anger. It looked like someone who finally understood peace. We begin by fighting the world, I whispered, and we end by forgiving it. Behind me, I heard Dad's chair scrape back. He walked to my side, resting a hesitant hand on my shoulder. Your mother would be proud, he said quietly. She already is, I replied. He nodded, eyes glistening, and for a brief moment we stood together, not as adversaries, not as teacher and rebel, but as father and daughter. Lillian's voice drifted from the table. Come back here, both of you. I want one more picture before I lose the light. We turned, smiling. Dad put his arm around me, awkward at first, then firmer. Lillian lifted her phone hands trembling and snapped the photo. The flash filled the room for a heartbeat, bright, fleeting, perfect. And as the light faded, I realized the past year hadn't been about revenge or redemption. It had been about learning how to stand again together. My father once said strength means never falling, but now I know strength is standing back up after you've